Ignorance is the first step. Now, what do I mean by that? Quite simply, we're born ignorant. All the knowledge we gain after we're born. We learn to read, we learn to write, we learn to walk, talk, we learn to play video games, we learn to cook and crochet and all those things that we do. And the thing is, by the time we go to our graves, we've learnt about this much of what there is to know in the world. Because when you think about the sheer breadth and width of knowledge in the world, all the different cultural knowledge, all the lost technologies, the languages, the physics and design and art and engineering and lost recipes and all that stuff. When you think about how much there is to know in the world, we know about this much. And the absolute smartest person in the world probably knows about that much. Except maybe the professor from Gilligan's Island. I think he knows about this much. But anyway, I got distracted. So, yeah, and most of us are afraid to be seen as being unintelligent in some area. I'm sure you've had a period. When is a time that you've been worried that people would find out that you didn't know about something? Why were you worried about it? With so much to know in the world, you can't possibly know everything. You know, was it because you're worried that people would think less of you? Or maybe you're just embarrassed. Maybe you'd been teased at school or embarrassed by someone, and yeah, you hated that. You know, that's fair enough. We all have our scars of different sorts. I'm going to tell you about a guy I know who I'm going to call Bob. Bob is capable of, if you give him all the basic stuff, he can build you a house. I mean, from figuring out the stuff from the plans, laying a concrete foundation, building the walls, setting up the plumbing, setting up the electricity, making sure the roof is on properly, doing the windows. He can literally do it all. On top of that, Bob, for a certain vintage of cars, the pre-electronic cars, can pull an older car apart, you know, into all its bits, put it back together and make the engine sing and make that car run really well. The thing about Bob is he can't read or write. And one of the things that always shat me was his family was constantly having a go at him and talking about, God, you're dumb. God, you're stupid. You don't know anything. It's like, this man has a skill set that most of us would kill for. But his family constantly brought him down. And the thing is, the only thing I can think of is their own insecurities were getting in the way. People bully because they're insecure. So his family bullied him because he couldn't read or write. He could function well enough to understand plans and measurements and basic costings and things like that. But he couldn't read a book. And he was always embarrassed about this stuff. And when he talked to me about this, I say, dude, you can do stuff I could only dream of. You're not thick. And he'd say, oh, yes, I am. My whole family says I am. I said, fuck them. They're ignorant, if anything else. So, yeah. And that's the thing. We all have our different strengths and weaknesses. We all have our different skill sets. A chunk of the time, we don't get to find out what those skill sets are. And that's because society isn't geared towards helping us find what we're good at. It's geared towards teaching us enough that we can work a job and getting us working a job and earning money so that we can buy crap we don't need. And again, though, there's so much out there to know. Crochet, science, cooking, engineering, all sorts of stuff, languages. But we all have some skill sets. You know, I'm sure you do. And what are your skill sets? What are you curious about? And do you explore those things as much as you really should? Because exploring them more is a way to learn more. And learning's great. It's okay not to know stuff, so long as you're open to being curious about things. Not knowing means you're open to growing. So do that. Kids are amazing for this. Right, people complain about how the kids are always asking questions. It's because kids are natural scientists. They want to know how everything works. And they're not afraid of being thought of as stupid or anything else, because for them, no question is stupid, because every time they get an answer, they've learnt something new. And that's the way we should continue to be through our lives. Don't be embarrassed about asking the stupid questions, because I can guarantee you that if you're in a classroom or a boardroom or wherever, and you've just asked the dumb question, and people have gone, oh, and laughed and things like that, there's almost certainly at least one other person in that room who also didn't know what they were talking about. And they're laughing because they're relieved that you've embarrassed yourself, they haven't embarrassed themselves. But if you hadn't asked the question, they would have just kept going on in ignorance. So, yeah. So, how do you learn more? Well, school's an obvious example, though schools aren't always great. When I was at school, I thought I hated history. Absolutely. It just did not work for me. I hated it. I thought it was the worst thing ever. 6 months after leaving school, I started to discover that, no, actually, I really like history. History's cool. You learn a lot from history. There's some fascinating stuff out there. And it's just the way they taught it was bad. So there are a lot of ways to learn more stuff. As I'm fond of saying, surround yourself with people who are smarter and better than you, because you'll learn a certain amount just by osmosis. But I want to quickly tell you about 3 Chinese grannies, 3 different Chinese grannies. I don't know their names. I don't remember their names, and I'd probably butcher them if I tried. So I'll just call them Bob, Bob, and Bob. And one of them I read about a couple of decades ago. She was in her 80s. And as with a lot of female Chinese children, she was never taught to read or write. She was never given any schooling because they saw it as a waste. She got into her 80s and she decided, I really want to learn to read and write. And so she started going off to preschool. And she went off and she started learning to read and write at the preschool, which is just fantastic. And the little kids loved her, and yeah. Another one that I just heard about is this woman. She's 102 years old, and she recently complained that she didn't know how to read or write. So her friends and neighbours got around and have done an intense 10-day course with her, teaching her all the Chinese characters and stuff that they can. Like, she's learnt about 100 Chinese characters, including the ones for her name. So now at 102, she's able to write her name for the first time in her life, which is just amazing. And the last Chinese granny, Bob, who I want to tell you about, at the age of 60, she decided that, again, she didn't know how to read or write. So she decided she wanted to learn how to read and write. And she did. She started learning at 60 how to read and write. Now, at 87, she has 3 books published. She didn't go into learning to read and write to learn how to write a book. She did it just to fulfill that need. And she's an author now. And that's the thing. No knowledge is wasted. It's just sometimes we don't have ways to implement that knowledge. But anything you learn is useful. It also rewires your brain in really interesting ways. My mum, when she was still alive, had a couple of brain scans about a year apart. I can't remember why now. But in that intervening time, I started playing dominoes with her on a regular basis, just to sort of try and keep her mind active. Now, there was nothing beyond it. There was nothing else beyond that. It was just trying to keep her mind active. But after the second brain scan, they were looking at her and saying, "Lola, have you been taking up anything new lately? Have you been doing anything new?" And she's like, "I don't know, Dan, what have I been doing?" I said, "No." I mean, we've been playing dominoes a lot. We started that in the last 6 months or so. And they went, "That'll be it." And we're like going, "What?" And they said, "Oh, there's all these new connections in her brain. They show up on the scans we're doing." It's like she was in her late 70s. And even at that age, just playing dominoes on a regular basis was rewiring her brain in new and interesting ways, which is really cool. And of course, as I say, you're never too old to learn anything. I recently grew to learn that I was ADHD. And knowing these things gives you power. Knowledge is always power. And learning that I was ADHD meant that I could finally understand why a few things worked the way they did and didn't work the way they did. And I've got myself diagnosed. I'm now on Ritalin, and you would have seen some of my other videos. It's changed my life. Knowledge is power. You don't have to know absolutely everything, but take every chance you can to learn something new. It rewires your brain. It keeps you young. It keeps you going. And let's face it, the way the world is at the moment, we really need people to be as smart as they possibly can. There are countless resources out there that you can access. There are free learning courses out there. There's Coursera and Khan Academy and all sorts of stuff like that. But also there's the people around you. You can ask people to teach you stuff. You can ask them questions. And yes, it might feel a bit embarrassing sometimes. But the upside is you'll learn. And trust me, take it from someone who does it. The more you get into asking the dumb questions, the easier it gets. And the more you learn. And that's great. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. Okay, my freaky darlings. Cheers.